On today's episode, I talk about the common ways a show could pod fade, and as I'm hanging around Europe, I take a trip to London to discover a podcast graveyard. Ooh.
Sound matters. Be heard. Welcome to the podcast where you get exclusive behind-the-scenes tips to make your own show sound truly spectacular. This is Podtastic Audio.
Hey, what's happening? How are you doing today? I want to say thank you so much for being here. I am Chris, and I am from the original Chris and Christine Show podcast. You can find out every single thing about that show on a website which I built all by myself. Yeah, check that out at chrisandchristineshow.com. And there's a link to it, in the show notes of this very episode. So scroll on down and there it is. Ta-da! Hey, but do you even have a podcast? Maybe you're thinking about starting a podcast and you're thinking like, you know what, Chris? I heard that a lot of shows that do start end up quitting or quote unquote pod fading after 7 or 10 episodes, and you would be correct. So why would somebody quit their show? Well, there's many different factors to come into play, but here I have the top 3 reasons why any podcast out there in the world, why would they pod fade? Here are some of those common reasons why podcasts do pod fade. Number 1 I have is actually lack of consistency. You see, inconsistency in publishing episodes can lead to a loss of audience engagement. Listeners often expect a regular release schedule, whether it's weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, yearly. Is that even a thing? Yearly podcasting? I don't know. But if a podcast fails to meet these expectations from the listeners, well, those listeners may tiptoe out of that podcast and say, you know what? I'm moving on to bigger and better things, because there is a lot. I don't know the exact number today, but there are a lot of podcasts out there to choose from. And if yours isn't keeping their attention because your lack of inconsistency, well, I know that personally, and people may just leave. And the number 2 reason why a podcast could pod fade, and that is due to content quality and relevance. Now, should I say lack of content quality? You see, podcasts that fail to deliver valuable and engaging content may experience a decline in listenership. If the topics covered are not interesting at all, aka boring, then the listeners may actually stop listening altogether. And when that happens, it's essential for podcasters to understand their target audience in the first place. So know who you're talking to and consistently provide content that meets their expectations. Don't forget who you're doing the show for. It's for your audience, and you want your audience to stick around. But if they do not stick around, I can see where this could be a potential problem for a show that is trying to make their mark in the podcasting space, and they just can't keep it going because they cannot see anybody sticking around, or nobody actually does stick around. So the number 3 reason why a podcast may pod fade, and that is your limited marketing and promotion. You see, you cannot just merely create the episode and say, I'm going to put it out there on Apple, Spotify, all the big ones, and just assume that everybody's going to find it and know all about it. Effective marketing and promotion are crucial for the success of any podcast. Even if the podcast has excellent content, it still may struggle to gain traction if it's not effectively promoted. Podcasters need to leverage social media, collaboration with other podcasters, and whatever other strategies you can think of to reach a wider audience. Without proper promotion, a podcast can remain undiscovered and struggle to expand its listener base. Now, these are not the only reasons why a show could potentially pod fade. Maybe you're in those similar situations. There's a lot of factors that go into play with coming to maybe you change your interests, maybe you're changing friends, maybe one friend wants to do the show, one friend does not want to do the show, maybe it's costing too much money to do the show, maybe you're thinking you're going to make some money with the show. a gazillion different reasons why a show could potentially pod fade. And speaking of pod fading, today on this episode, I take a journey all the way over to London where I run into James Bishop. He is the founder of One Fine Play, a production and content creation services. And he just created and launched a brand new podcast all about pod fading. It's called Podcast Graveyard, where he talks to shows and co-hosts of shows that have died, have pod faded, and pretty much have been buried out in the graveyard. And he talks to them about why did their show fail? What happened? What did they do right? What did they do wrong? And at the end of the show, they discuss whether or not they should resurrect the show and bring it back to life. It's all in this whole creepy graveyard theme, and I think it's fantastic. So here is my conversation with James Bishop from Podcast Graveyard. You know, you being in podcasting, when did you first get into podcasting and like content creation?
Podcasting I got into in about 2018. Prior to that, I'd been working in television, and I'd been side hustling my television job by watching a lot of YouTube. And I've really been deep in podcasting since 2015. I've been deep in content creation since 2015.
Gotcha. So when you're in television, what did you do for TV?
I made sports docs.
Oh, so you made documentaries?
Documentaries for a thing we have in the UK called football. You might have heard of it. I think you called it something. You give it another silly name. Yeah.
Soccer. Okay, yeah. So I know football's massive over there, and you guys, it's like your football is real football. Like, you know, actually kicking the ball. So, were these documentaries on like Netflix or like regular BBC, or how'd it go?
I don't want to age myself too much, but it was sort of pre the big explosion of Netflix. So we were looking at BBC and ITV and Sky, things like that.
Oh, fantastic, man.
For a load of people that you probably haven't heard of. Yeah. Well, you might have heard of. Yeah. Made a documentary about Wayne Rooney. You know who that is?
I have to Google him, but I don't...
Yeah, see, this is going to be a long... Let's not worry about who they were for. But made some television documentaries. And essentially what happened was I worked as part of a team making a documentary about a footballer that was commissioned by a major channel. And it took 15 people and about 8 months to make a documentary and probably $150,000. And it was then consumed. Oh, and at the same time during that process, I was a big YouTube fan and watched loads of stuff. I probably am still more of a YouTube nerd than a podcast nerd from a consumption perspective. And my favorite YouTuber at the time, and still one of my favorite YouTubers, who's a guy called Casey Neistat, he was making his daily vlog. And this documentary that had taken all that resource was watched by fewer people in the first 24 hours than a video Casey had made on his own in 24 hours and posted for free on YouTube.
Right, yeah.
And so he'd got more attention and more eyeballs on his piece of content in 24 hours and was going to put out another one the next day than this huge team of people in 7 months. And so it was really one of the final nails in the coffin for me thinking, okay, yeah, I've really got to go with this and find a way to get deeper into content creation and the digital space and the online game than traditional television.
Yeah, well, a lot of TV production places or TV studios are, sending their content also to YouTube because they do know that their eyeballs are there too.
Sure, but that's very true. This was back in like 2016, 2017, and a lot of what I was saying about podcasting and YouTube was falling on deaf ears because there was still this hope that television would retain the attention. I left and went off to work in podcasting and digital video, production of content for the internet. And it took a few years for the TV execs to realize that they needed to shift their energy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I love myself some YouTube too. I was actually on YouTube before Google owned it. That's how old I am when it comes to
YouTube. That is a long time.
On YouTube. But for me, when I looked at YouTube kind of as a place to, like, if you think about YouTube, people don't realize this. It's actually a social media platform like Facebook's and the other ones. And so I was putting it up there like just a platform just to put stuff to kind of share videos out to family and friends because you couldn't quite email a video. It was just too large. Still is. So I would just create the video, put on YouTube, and then I would send out the link and that kind of stuff, really. But I never really consider myself as like, quote unquote, a YouTuber, you know. But I think a lot of people do, and they try to put all their eggs into the YouTube basket, especially with podcasting. So when it comes to podcasting, which primarily usually is an audio format, but it can be anything these days. What are your thoughts on those that create the whole video podcast versus, say, the audio podcast?
So this may come as a surprise to you, but 95% of my attention as a creator is on YouTube.
Wow.
I understand podcasting and it as a medium, and I think it's great for some stuff. But yeah, I'm YouTube through and through.
YouTuber. That's fantastic.
I wish I could take that name, and I have done a whole lot of restructuring in the business in the last few months so that I can put myself in the position to go on the journey to becoming a person of influence on YouTube as a platform. You see, here's the thing. You have two types of platform, right?
Yeah.
You have platforms where you can build relationships. So a podcast is a good example of that. A blog, an email newsletter, they're really good for depth of relationship. And then you have discovery platforms like YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, whatever else.
Right.
But YouTube really has stood the test of time. And I think the balance between creativity on the platform, its monetization, and its ability with search just makes it unparalleled to anything else out there.
It does. Well, YouTube also, they know how to keep you there. They've got that figured out. Like almost like a casino. Speaking of Vegas, like a casino will keep you inside playing the machines. Yeah. YouTube will keep you watching YouTube videos, even places that you're not subscribed to. Videos that you have no idea where they came from just pop up in your feed. Like, hey, check this out. Check that out.
Absolutely. So I'm not saying that podcasting isn't a great idea. I have a podcast. I work in it a lot. I'm a massive champion of it. But for me, YouTube is where it's at. YouTube is where I put my energies. It's the thing that I'm really passionate about moving forward.
Well, you know, one thing I do notice about YouTube versus, like, say, audio podcasting world and the YouTube space, one thing I do notice is that with YouTube, everybody can see all your data, like your stats, because your video plays are all like listed right there versus like podcasting, that stuff's all super hidden, right? So people either lie about it or they maybe even pay people to pay like bots to kind of like boost their numbers, boost their ego. And I'm sure that people on YouTube do the same thing or whatever. But I always kind of wondered, like, with the video podcasting and being so exposed, does it make you feel kind of nervous growing a YouTube channel when you see that?
Ultimately, it's the lack of transparency. And transparency is a combination of data and technology in podcasting that will be its demise if that ever arrives. The lack of transparency is the problem. It's so difficult in simple terms, right? It's really difficult for an advertiser to invest heavily in podcasting because they don't know what's going on.
Well, they have
because
that.
there's no transparency.
Well,
so
yeah.
In many ways, attracting new advertisers and therefore keeping the medium alive by using a platform that offers more transparency, i.e. more data, more analytics, more tech stack to allow for investment and attribution and all the other things that come with that functionality is only, in my opinion, a good thing for podcasting. I do understand why, but this whole secrecy and only certain people can see downloads and all the challenges that come behind the scenes in podcasting, which is what's stopping it from being a hugely growth industry, are really challenging for it as a medium.
Yeah, I get that. That's a very interesting point. I always kind of wondered why on podcasting, if you're ever in the social media platforms, you will see people that will brag, I just hit my first 1,000,000 downloads or 1,000 downloads or 10 downloads, whatever it is. It also can be kind of deflating too for some people when they're a content creator and they're trying to make it and, earn their space in the podcasting community, and they may have hit their first, 100 downloads, and then you see a post that says, I hit my first 1,000,000. It can feel a little deflating. I guess the same way with a YouTuber too, when they're trying to inspire to be this great YouTube channel, and yet they've got 10 followers, I guess they got to keep plugging away at it and just go for it, right?
I mean, it's a complex conversation. I think there's a big difference between followers and fans. So I don't really think that relatively downloads is that interesting. If you have 10 downloads to your podcast every episode, but each of those 10 downloads, the name of the person, and they would buy any product that you launched, and you're solving a problem in their life, then that's much more valuable than 1,000,000 downloads of random people you know nothing about that are across, a huge variety of, different parts of what's the word I'm looking for? Cross section of the population that become much less loyal and much harder to monetize or whatever.
Right.
Right. So like I made a podcast for someone who's a good friend of mine now, and he launched his podcast. And what he did was he interviewed the managing partners of venture capital firms. And the show only got 175 downloads at its maximum. But the listeners to the show were fans of what he was saying, of what he was doing. And when he came to raise money for his business, he raised $6 million. And it was primarily attributed to the fact he'd had a podcast that had that 175 listeners, because they were all in the target demographic of the people that he needed to speak to when he wanted to raise money.
Nice.
So that versus I've got 10,000 downloads, but I don't really know who they are, and they're from all walks of life, and they're all around the world, and it's sporadic, and I got them by saying, follow me if I follow you, and whatever other nonsense it is that people come up with. I don't really see how that's helping.
Right. I totally agree. Like I was saying that I would rather have, dedicated listeners write me or contact me directly and saying that was a great episode, I like this, or maybe I didn't like this, contact me directly versus, like I said, 1,000,000 plays of randos. You don't know who they are and they don't really care. It's just noise to them.
Absolutely. And if you're doing it for fun and you don't care, then if you're doing it for fun and therefore you're not worried about who's listening and you're not trying to monetize, then do it for yourself, and therefore it doesn't matter whether one person listens or 10 or 100 or 1,000. So, I definitely think it's something that requires you to understand your objectives, understand your purpose, and think about who you want to be listening and why.
Right. So speaking of creating podcasts, I know you're saying you're more video YouTube first. But what would be, in your opinion, James, what you'd say would make a good podcast versus a bad podcast?
Well, that's a complicated question. I'm just going to nip back a second to what you were asking me earlier about video podcasting, because I think I just want to cover off that I don't really understand what YouTube is trying to achieve in video podcasting. I don't have the inside track to anyone there. I just see it as another opportunity for distribution and for attention, and it comes up really well in search results and when people are looking for stuff. And I think that shorts is a really powerful way to grow followers. I've also noticed more and more people saying the sentence, I watch podcasts, not I listen to them.
Interesting.
I don't even know what a podcast is at this point, to be honest. It's
right.
A bit of a confusing idea. Being much debated, obviously not by me. So, yeah, I think even if you have a still image over your audio, you should be using some kind of YouTube channel for it, whether that's ingesting your RSS feed into YouTube or just starting a channel and uploading, which is what I do. I think it's a really smart move. Even if you learn, even if you close it down later or leave it untouched, you'll learn in the short term. I also really like about YouTube and video podcasting that there's a comment section on YouTube, which people use, like you were saying earlier. So underneath the video, you get direct feedback. rather than in podcasting where you don't really know. You have to work so much harder to get that feedback. But the comment section on your YouTube videos of your podcast, people will just tell you what they think. And that's, I think, super valuable.
It also can be brutal too, because people can say not the nicest things.
Yeah, but who do you care what Johnny Pants 47 has to say if all he can do is write horrible things to you?
Yeah,
like, you got to feel sorry for that person.
Right. Yeah. We've had some trolls on Twitter and things like that, and I've gotten them once in a while here and there, and they just start digging and digging. And sometimes they get under your skin and you just got to like block, delete. And
to use a Gary Vaynerchuk expression, you never hear other players booing. It's only the people in the stands that boo.
Hey,
so don't worry about what they're doing.
Just worry that.
Right? Other players on the pitch with you are not booing. They're all supportive of each other. So don't worry about the random guy that probably doesn't have a profile picture that can only write hate. Like, just feel sorry for that guy. He must be a really miserable, he or she must be a really miserable, lonely individual that you got to feel sorry for. Just, don't worry about it.
Oh man, well, I know with content creation, there comes a point that any content creation, whether you're a TikToker, Instagram, or podcast, or YouTube, whatever you're doing, at some point you're going to start from like a small zero audience, and hopefully you do grow into like a much bigger, more popular, and I wouldn't say celebrity status, but you get up there. How do people like adjust to that level of fame, or does it go to their head, or do they screw it all up? In your experiences, how do you help people do that?
I think it's a fairly organic process for most people. They go on a journey and they tend to keep it in check. I think that if you are accelerated to a level of fame really quickly, which happens to a few people, either if you've been on a reality TV show, for example, or there have been a few other cases, then it can be more tricky. But we live in an era of getting cancelled and of, 5 minutes of fame. And it's a complicated one. That's something that you have to learn to navigate. I think having my biggest piece of advice on that, which is what we do with all the shows that we're responsible for and all the content we make, is we think of them as businesses. So we don't think of a podcast as this bit of audio that you're recording and putting out on the internet. We think of it as a business. So it needs a mission, it needs a business plan, it needs a profit and loss, it needs to understand its target audience, how big the audience is, how its tone of voice, how it ends, all these different things. And it needs characters within it to make it possible and a team of people around it. And when you think about it like that, it becomes much easier to manage and, direct where it's going and the impact that it has and the footprint that it makes. And that approach normally tends to help keep the talent that's involved on track and not becoming too obnoxious.
That's interesting you say that, because you have a podcast that's out right now called Podcast Graveyard, which I think it's a fantastic show. And I think it's a fantastic concept where you talk to podcasters that had a show that they thought, I'm going to be big, I'm going to be massive, we're going to make this thing amazing. And then after a few episodes, maybe sometimes even 2 episodes, they call quits and they just say, forget this ain't worth it. I think it's a fantastic concept. When did you think of the concept and how did it come about?
Thank you for your kind words about the show. So the truth is kind of actually an amusing story. So I employ a developer, a guy who writes code, who I've known for years, and we build some. One Fine Play is really now a product business rather than a production company. The production company is part of what we do, but we build products to help creators, really. And he helps to do that. And he had this idea for a thing which was called Startup Graveyard. So about all the dead startups, all the dead businesses, Yeah. OpenAI feels like it might be on on track to Startup Graveyard in the next few days based on the news of today.
Uh-oh, what happened?
I don't know if you've seen it.
No, I have not.
Oh, okay. Well, that's a different story for another time. You'll catch up on the news, I'm sure. You won't miss it. So the idea was Startup Graveyard. And I loved that idea, but I realized that, you see, there's this thing in podcasting where I think it's really important as a host if you want to make a show that really grabs attention, for you to have a real dose of relevance to why you're the host of the show. And you need to be able to share some kind of experience and a unique lens through which you look at whatever it is that you're talking about, so that you can then share wisdom with your community or have some level of, insight into the conversations. And I just felt from a startup perspective, I didn't have enough gravitas, but I knew that from a podcasting perspective, I did. So Startup Graveyard became Podcast Graveyard. And I became really passionate about the idea because I'm a big believer that, let's just take One Fine Play, the production company that I run. The successes that we've had are nowhere near as interesting as the learnings along the way. The challenge with the learnings is not what we've learned that's right. It's what we've learned that's wrong that's really valuable. What we've learned that doesn't work. You see, creative is infinite. So you can continually come up with ideas. You can continually come up with new things to try. You can continually experiment. But it's fairly certain things that won't work. If you stick your finger in a fire, it's going to burn. That is just a fact. And so there's lots of those things within the journey of podcasting that are true. And so a lot of the philosophy of our production company is built around this is what not to do. And Podcast Graveyard, talking to people who had failed in making a podcast, seemed really interesting because it would highlight those challenges and the things not to do, and that would become beneficial to other people. And there are somewhere around 4 million podcasts in total, allegedly. And if you go by some data from people in the industry, there are probably around 400,000 active podcasts. That's shows that have posted in the last 90 days, which gave me some quick maths, meaning that there were going to be 3.5 million podcasts that could potentially come on the show.
Yeah, you got
that. That felt like a big enough pool that I could keep the show going for a while.
Now, how do you reach out to these folks if they've killed off their podcast? Are they even because their email is probably not being used, the one for the show. So how do you get a hold of them?
Well, that's an interesting one. It's had a few challenges, to be honest. So the first is something that we were very aware of when we started out. And I'm going to tell you a slight side story. I made a show called Fear Itself with a well-known British socialite as the host. And on the podcast Fear Itself, it talked to people, primarily famous people. We had guests like Richard Branson on the show.
Oh, nice.
About the biggest failures. But what came to light was two things. One, people don't like talking about failure, especially publicly. And two, advertisers didn't want to get behind a show talking about failure. So when it came to Podcast Graveyard, there were lots of parallels. So I was very aware that it might become a challenge to get people on the show and talk about failure. And what we've come to learn is in the short term, and the show's only been running, 3 weeks. I've made like 8 episodes at this point. It's a very male-dominated industry. So lots and lots of men have asked to be on the show. So we've worked really hard last few weeks to try and diversify our audience in all ways, not just women, all the other ways you can think of too.
Of course.
And so that's been important. Also had lots of offers from people who I haven't taken up at this point, who work in podcasting or work in the industry, run a production company or work in film or whatever. And they weren't as interesting because there's only so many of those you can do. So we've done a few of those and I've got lots more that I could do. We weren't sure how it would be received. And I am humbled to say that it's been received really, really well so far. And that's now put me in a position where I'm able to reach out to shows that I would love to have on, which is what I've actually been doing for most of today, is approaching shows that I either used to love that don't publish anymore or are of notoriety or, bigger shows. So currently in the process of doing that. And then it's a numbers game. I have what I like to think of as a compelling pitch deck, one that's been tried and tested over our many years as a production company. We've actually built a product around it, which you can see at pitchpod.io. And if you want to do this, there's a free Notion template. So we built the pitch decks in Notion as well. And you can download the template that I use to reach out to all my guests. And you can go and get that for yourself for nothing.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah, so it's just then a numbers game, you know? And it's also takes time to win over a potential guest. The idea that you just rock up and go, hey, do you want to come on my show, and think they're going to say yes, I guess is a little bit audacious. So, you know, it's about putting in the groundwork. Yeah,
I know that there's a lot of shows out there that, I mean, I'm not exclusively an interview show. I'm doing one today, a surprise, but I believe that try to balance it out. That's just my opinion, because I do know that as the host of any show, you are the constant that happens every single time some person's play. You're the one that's always there. The guest is there, but it's a different guest. You don't know what you're going to get with the guest. It's like random, you know, who knows what. So I do know there's a lot of shows out there that have to get a guest and get anybody. They'll throw anybody on the show. So having like a proper like pitch and a proper way to present yourself to get the proper guests you want to get. And I did a whole episode on this recently about, you know, there are a lot of shows that think that if they only get celebrity guests, if they got to get the celebrity guests, that they will become famous too. The celebrity guests are valuable. But I think to an audience listener that as long as the value of whatever's being said on that show, that episode, is probably more important than just the name.
Oh, absolutely. And we could do a whole hour on this if you want it, on this one thing. So there are only this the simple my distillation of that is there are only two stakeholders in a podcast, you and the audience. Guests come and go. They maybe turn up, they maybe don't. And so really you've got to focus on the value that you're bringing to your audience. And my biggest piece of advice, I suppose, in this topic is to work out when you're talking to a guest what it is specifically that you want to talk to them about. So if you think about Podcast Graveyard, I invite on a guest. I don't ask them anything about themselves. There's no origin story. There's no where they work, who they are, what they do, none of that. I just talk to them about their podcast. Because what I'm interested in is their experience of this one thing. So it doesn't really matter who they are or where they come from to a certain extent. I want them to tell me how they felt, the emotions it brought up, the experiences they had, their learnings, their takeaways around making a podcast. And I share that with my listener. And then it's that consistent relationship with my listener and me that is what helps to grow the show.
Well, of talking with these past podcasters, right, and then them kind of like talking about their shows and stuff, have you find a common thread of what kind of killed the shows off? Is one thing kind of like, oh, that seems to be a common theme with what kills these shows?
There are common themes, but not as many as you would think. Because the initial reaction when we were planning the show with my production team was, oh, this is going to become really repetitive really fast.
Yeah.
In fact, we had a production meeting today, and one of the bits of feedback I got was, James, could you just please stick to the questions that we originally asked? Because what's interesting is getting the answer to the same questions over and over. So I asked people a question like, what is the worst piece of podcasting advice you ever got?
Yeah, I remember that,
for example. And it's the repetition of that question that becomes interesting. The main things that you hear are time invested in making the show is probably the number one thing, just how long it takes to make a great podcast. And then people tend to fall into the same traps. However, because I'm diversifying the audience I'm reaching out to, because I'm diversifying the listeners, the guests I'm reaching out to, I'm looking at different size shows in different countries in different genres, because I hope that will help to keep the answers different. So there's lots of learning for my audience, because what I'm really trying to do here is build a relationship with my audience.
That is important. You should really know who you're speaking to. So who do you think your audience really is for that show?
That's a great question. The audience for the show is actually a really mixed bunch of people, I've come to learn. It's definitely the people within the podcasting industry. I know that lots of the industry is listening to it. I also know that there are people thinking about getting into podcast listening. I can give you quite a bit of data on this. I should have come more prepared. But it tends to be founders, marketing managers, people were producers, and then, interestingly, people not working in podcasting at all that are just kind of fascinated about how podcasts are made. And I'm not talking about like my mum and dad. They're obviously fans.
Right.
But all kinds of other people I know who've listened to all the episodes who have nothing to do with the industry and nothing to really do with making content. I think part of it is to do with the fact that it's quite a stylized show. Like I do it in the style of a memorial service.
Yeah. When did you decide to, is that because it was the title podcast Graveyard you decided to do in that style, or has it always been that style?
It came up as a silly idea because of the idea of a graveyard. And then we just thought, okay, let's play on this more. I'm not a fan of your standard interview show that starts, okay, so where did you grow up? And, you know, how was your relationship with your dad? And where did you go to school? Like, you know, those origin story type podcasts that aren't really about anything.
A dime a dozen.
Right. And I wasn't ever going to do that. I've very much made the show as partly because I wanted to make a show. And I've been 5 years in podcasting without making one. And plenty of ideas before this one. But also I wanted to use it as an example. I wanted to use it as a test bed. I wanted to use it to experiment. So, for example, I launched the show day one with adverts. And I've done lots of things within the show that are very specific, so I can use them as examples when speaking to a client or when I'm trying to show someone something about, why... We basically practice what we preach. And so by having a specific style that made it stand out, that was a bit different, was something that we really wanted to do. And the graveyard funeral thing became a memorial service. And then we just got carried away one day. And then we were like, oh, we could have, you could do the impression of being like someone who hosts a service. And then we could have the ghosts of the podcast as the guests. And then the idea spiraled, and we're actually currently working on a live event, which is going to be in London in a few months' time, where we're going to do a live podcast recording and that kind of thing. And it's going to be in the style of a wake. So we're going to ask everyone to come dressed in black.
No way.
just for a bit of fun.
That's great, man. That's great.
Thank you. That's also why the questions aren't all that serious. I like ask people questions that may be a surprise to some people, like how much money did you spend making it? And, like I said earlier, that question of the worst advice they'd had. We're like trying to bring a sense of lightheartedness to it.
I think those are great questions, though. I think they're great because everybody, I mean, people know, as a podcaster, we all kind of have an idea how much we spend on this stuff personally, but to find out what other people are doing and spending, it kind of pulls the curtain back for things that we all kind of want to know, but are kind of afraid to ask each other because no one really wants to say. It's almost like how much money you make a year. Nobody wants to talk about it, but you have an idea of what it is. But you go out and actually ask them that.
It definitely feels, listening back, like a little bit like a spoonful of sugar. You can listen to it and you can either learn from it, or you can kind of take a level of comfort that you've also made a silly mistake that someone else has made. So there's lots of ways you can approach it and it doesn't alienate people, or that's the aim of it anyway.
Yeah, we all learn. I mean, the advice is like, it's always good to learn from your mistakes. It's even better if you can learn from somebody else's mistakes.
I guess it's also a case of trying to educate people but without feeling too self-righteous or like it's a TED Talk. Because I don't think that's something that people want either. You don't want to get on the microphone and just, shout people down about all the dumb things that they're doing. Like earlier on, you asked me the question, what makes a good podcast? And I sort of swerved it because it's a very difficult question to answer succinctly. And we're not here to just make people feel silly or think about all the things that they haven't done or overwhelm them. So I guess that's the take. We see, inside scoop. I don't think I've told anyone this before. I have the idea, which I've been developing for a couple of weeks, to do a Sunday sermon second episode, which will be a solo episode that comes out on a Sunday. The podcast comes out on a Tuesday.
Okay.
At the end of every podcast episode, so essentially the setup to the episode is an introduction, like it's a memorial, and then I introduce the ghost of the episode, who's the host. We talk through these questions, and it's got a fairly simple narrative structure where I use a 3-act narrative. And then at the end, I close with 3 lessons from that service. And then the idea is on a Sunday, I will do a Sunday sermon where I go deeper into one of those 3 lessons as a solo episode, maybe for 10 or 15 minutes. However, one of the things that we're struggling with at the moment is the style and the tone of voice of that, so it doesn't become a boring, tedious lecture that goes against the essence of the whole brand that we're trying to build.
Yeah, I think people, I just did an episode on this recently about people where either people just read a script verbatim and they sound very monotone and they have this very like, you can tell they're reading, even if they're, especially on video, you can kind of tell, and they don't feel natural versus a very natural tone. So how, I mean, your best opinion, like how would people try to make a show that sounds natural, but has a script? Like, how do you do that?
That is another challenge that we talk about internally. How do you make it entertaining? I think it's just, to be honest, it's about a couple of things. Number one, it's about understanding the character that you're playing and really then writing a script that aligns to that character. So the character I play in Podcast Graveyard, I'm supposed to be like, the undertaker or the vicar or the person hosting the memorial. So I kind of sound fairly serious, right? I have very clear, but then also to map your character. So what's your origin story in a few sentences? What are your likes? What are your dislikes? What is your point of view? What are your opinions and how do you share those? How do you communicate all of these things in your content? So what is your tone of voice? And if you can really get all of those things clear, then that allows you to make an episode that reflects all of that stuff. And then after that, it's just practice.
Yeah,
just the same
practice makes perfect, yeah.
Just the same as the first time that you're a podcast guest, you're not great at it. Or the first time that you drive a car, you're not that great, If all else fails, persistence prevails, right? You've got to keep on keeping on.
That's right. And I think a lot of podcasters get in their head, especially with episode 1, their first time doing it, or they release it. You're like, oh my gosh, everyone's listening to this. Oh my gosh, I hope I didn't screw this up. But no one's really listening to your first episode. Come on now, I mean, it will grow eventually, but I'm saying like they put so much pressure on themselves. I always try to relax and, keep it casual. That's the way I do it. Like I don't script much at all. And I try to just talk like I'm talking directly to you, like I'm talking to the listener directly. That's kind of how I perceive and how I do a solo episode. I can imagine that we're hanging out and having a conversation.
I mean, it absolutely depends on your style, right? I work on and have worked in our production company on shows that are fairly unscripted through to shows that are scripted to within an inch of their life. I make a podcast where I know every question I'm going to ask you in the interview. I have a fully written script, which I literally read out, and then every single question is written, and I've done research in advance of the recording, so I pretty much know their answers, because one of our researchers will have done a call with the podcast guest, so I know when I say to them, what's your, how much money did you spend? We've already done a pre-call, so I already know the answer, because I think that we end up with better content that way. But then we're doing 6 to 8 hours of editorial on every episode for Podcast Graveyard as well.
Wow, check that out. That's a long time. But
that's just on the edit. That's just on the edit of the core story. So once we've done that, we then record the rappers, and then it gets mastered, and the sound bed gets added. So it's like probably a 12-hour edit per episode. So there's nothing's left to chance. But that also means I'm also not saying yet. See, another question you asked earlier, which I didn't point out, which might be interesting, is that it's proving okay to find guests, but I'm probably only saying yes to 30% of the guests that are saying yes.
Well, yeah, you should be selective. It's your show. You just,
Yeah.
You should really. I know people. I know shows that will invite anybody on the show. Hey, mom, or have the dog on the show or whatever. But just to have somebody on the show because I got to make an episode this week and I need somebody. Anybody come on, and it can, especially if you're doing an interview show and you're relying on guests as part of the show. That you have to. What? Sorry.
No, I was just going to say it's absolutely different styles for different types of shows, Like it depends on what you're trying to do. I'm trying to do something in Podcast Graveyard very specific. And because it's so stylistic, there isn't a lot of flexibility.
Yeah, but one thing I was going to say, what you were saying about actually having the answers already pre-written or pre-figured out. I know you got them scripted out, but for some podcasters that already kind of know the answers, they also kind of feel like they're afraid to ask the question because they already know, but the audience doesn't know what they already know. You know what I'm saying? That trap they fall into.
In the way that we do it, the guest doesn't know that they know the answer to the question.
Okay.
Because we didn't say, here's the question. We don't tell them the questions we're going to ask them. We just do a prep call. The researcher does a prep call and we'll have asked them a bunch of questions along the way and just give them an idea of what might happen. So we have an idea, and we also use Google and the internet to find a whole load of our own answers out.
Okay.
Just prefer to go in that way on our show. But as I say, we've worked on a whole bunch of different shows. But yes, I think it's a pretty bad idea. It makes for very difficult content if the guest knows the answer to the question you're about to ask them before you ask it to them.
Right. I've heard shows like that where they will do the entire question answer. They'll send them the guest all the questions. The guest will fill them out. They'll send them back, and they will just read them down one by one in order. And the guest will says, "That's an interesting question." And they'll just read their answer that they wrote down. And it almost feels like bad acting at some point.
That's true. And also, I mean, often I'm sure you've heard the saying before: the greatest answers come from the simplest questions. But also some of the greatest answers come at the very end of someone's ramblings when they're just sort of talking and they're not thinking too much and they're very much in the moment and it's not premeditated, which is what happens if you've told them the questions in advance. The number of, one of the things that we often say to our podcast hosts is just let your guest keep talking. Just stay silent that little bit longer than feels comfortable because they're probably about to say the best thing of the episode.
And if it's just nonsense, gibberish, you always can edit that out. Editing can be your friend, People, I can't believe people still put shows out without editing. I can't believe they do that still.
Well, don't get me started on this topic. But yes, happens all the time for all kinds of hilarious reasons that they give you.
So your company, One Fine Play, as we wrap this up here, what does that whole package serve? What do you offer to content creators in a nutshell?
Okay, two sides to the business. One side is a production company. It's fairly niche. If you have $20,000 in advance or more that you want to spend on a show, then we'd love to talk to you about helping. The other side of the business, we're building products for creators, primarily for brands. What we've done is we've built a thing called the One Fine Playbook. It's essentially a Notion template right now that's becoming a fully blown app that helps you go from idea to ear with your content. We became very aware fairly early on in podcasting that it's what we refer to as the first mile of content where you really build muscle and where the work is really done to generate success. Now, the podcast industry and the content production industry in general skews to last mile of content. So that's your hacks, your shortcuts, your AI tools. In a podcasting sense, it's very much, and you definitely can't be accused of this because you don't even record video, but I'm sure you've seen it. The kind of person who wants to record 4 podcast conversations and then cut them up for clips on social media, and that's their main focus. It's like, how do I get as many downloads and likes and impressions and vanity metrics as possible with no real substance?
Yeah.
Lots of those shows end up in the graveyard. So the thing that One Fine Play has always really focused on has been finding shows that were headed for the graveyard and then taking their creators through a concept development process where we establish their goals, their audience, how they're going to monetize, what their marketing plan is, what industry they're in, their characters, the story, the style, all that stuff that no one wants to sit down and do. So essentially build a business plan around your podcast and then work out how you can get some great ideas from that. And then work out from there in podcasting sense what your podcast is going to be about. You do that bit at the end, not first, because there's so many different creative options for your podcast. And so what we've done is develop that into a product for the whole of the content production flywheel of a business. And now we implement that into businesses and deliver accountability coaching around it. So it's a 12-week program, starts out with answering lots of those unsexy questions. And then it evolves into weekly calls where we say, what did you do last week? What are you going to do this week? And if it's that you've just done a blog, if you just do a blog for your business and that's all you've got capacity for now, but you want to get better results, then we'll help you with that. If you want to start another channel, then we'll help you with that. We'll make sure that you're getting stuff done and out there, because really it's about becoming visible and building that social wealth that really accelerates companies forwards. But what they struggle with is the systems and processes to make that happen. So that's what we spend our time doing, and we've built a whole range of accessible products around that side of the business.
Nice. Now,
have you checked out our have you ever been to onefineplay.com/directory?
Yes, I have. Wait, the directory, I've been to the whole website. I've played around I checked the whole thing out, and I was looking at all of your services page, and it's all in pounds, I believe, is the currency.
It is.
Yeah. So I'm looking at that, and I'm like, okay, well, I don't know the conversion. Well, just in London not too long ago, wife was, and she was telling me all that stuff, trying to figure out the conversion and stuff. But yeah, so I was looking at different things. And I do remember, was there an editing page on there too, like editing services only?
Not really.
Okay.
I mean, no, not only as part of a bigger buy-in. We're not really a gun for hire.
Yeah. There's a lot of those out there, and a lot of them I noticed were like in other countries. Not saying you too, but like Philippines and like India and places like that where you can get a podcast edited for $5. I don't even know. I don't know what you're
hoping for if you do that. But
right, yeah, totally.
But the podcast directory is actually a really interesting tool. It's at onefineplay.com/directory. And what it is, when I started at podcasting 2018, I'd not done anything in podcasting before. So I just kept an Excel doc of every company I came across in the industry. And when it got to about 1,000 companies, I started to be fascinated by how many companies were doing the same thing. And then what happened was, over the space of a couple of months, I kept getting introduced to new companies who were, this is going back maybe 2 years now. They're going, oh, this company is just starting an AI business that will repurpose your content. And I would say, there's about 20 others. And they would say, no, I don't know. And I realized that this Excel spreadsheet that I had, I should share with the world. So over a few iterations, it's now become a fully functioning directory where you can log in, you can create your own listings, you can upvote, you can favorite, you can comment, all that kind of stuff within this directory. So it's totally free. And I just think it's a really valuable resource. It's broken down into a whole bunch of different categories so that it's easy to manage. And I really do invite anyone who wants to find a solution to their creative problem to go check it out.
Yeah, I mean, we're all looking for the answers, and I know that there's so much noise out there when it comes to anything podcasting or even video or content creation out there, that if you can narrow it down and whittle it down to to some kind of something that we can use to hopefully make better content. And that's really what it is all about, is making better content without having to, I don't know, get stressed out and hopefully end up in the graveyard, like a lot of these folks have,
Absolutely. I get asked on a daily basis by people with podcasts to never invite them on my podcast graveyard.
Oh, really?
They are the same as you. I hope that you're never a guest on my podcast.
Oh, well.
In the nicest possible way, because that would mean it's in the graveyard, and that would be sad.
Oh, that is true, man. Well, James, man, this has been so great having you on the show, joining me all the way from London today, man. Really quickly here, where can everybody find out about you and all your wonderful stuff?
So I can be found at James Bishop IO, wherever you're searching, or the business is at One Fine Play.
Great, man. That's fantastic, buddy. Well, you have a great rest of your evening. I know it's getting late over there, and I will catch you later, man.
Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Hey, thank you once again for listening. And if you found any value from listening to this podcast today, maybe you learned something new or something that can benefit your podcast, please share this episode with a friend. Every single podcast player has an app that has a sharing feature built right into it. Just click the little tab and share it with all of your friends that possibly could need to use this information to create a better podcast for them. And I will see you on the next episode.